While the world often assumes Africa will quietly absorb the consequences of global pollution, Tunisia and Nigeria are rising to transform that expectation, shifting the continent's role from passive recipient to active challenger in the fight for environmental justice. Recent reports show a silent crisis unfolding along Africa's coasts and river deltas, where ordinary people are demanding the right to clean air, safe water, and dignity. This is not just a local tragedy or an isolated incident. It is a continental struggle for environmental sovereignty, a battle to reclaim control over Africa's land, resources, and future from the grip of foreign interests and entrenched power structures. The urgency is real. In the past year alone, hospital admissions in affected regions have surged, and protests are growing louder. The stakes could not be higher. To truly understand what is at risk, we need to look beyond the headlines and examine the forces shaping these crises. Our journey begins in Gabes, a city on Tunisia's southeastern coast, where the air itself has become a battleground. In recent weeks, mothers have rushed their children to overcrowded hospitals, desperate for relief, as toxic gas leaks send waves of panic through the community. Observers note that children are collapsing in classrooms, gasping for breath, their lungs burning from invisible poisons. The source of this suffering is no mystery. Towering over the city is the Tunisian chemical group's phosphate plant, a sprawling industrial complex that has shaped Gabes' fate for decades. To understand how Gabes became a symbol of environmental horror, we must trace the arc of Tunisia's industrial ambitions and the broader historical context that set the stage. In the 1970s, Tunisia discovered vast reserves of phosphate, a mineral essential for global fertilizer production. Eager to boost exports and fuel economic growth, the government built the Gabes plant, promising jobs and prosperity. For a time, the city thrived. But beneath the surface, a toxic legacy was taking root. The main byproduct of phosphate processing is phosphogypsum, a chalky waste laced with heavy metals and radioactive elements. Instead of being safely contained, this waste has been dumped directly into the Gulf of Gabes for years. The sea, once teeming with fish and supporting generations of fishermen, has turned murky and lifeless. Beaches are stained with chemical residue. The air carries a sharp, acrid smell that clings to skin and clothing. Recent data shows that the health consequences are staggering. Cancer rates in Gabes have soared, with respiratory illnesses now commonplace among residents. Doctors report a surge in cases of asthma, bronchitis, and other lung diseases, especially among children and the elderly. Some studies suggest a possible link to increased osteoporosis, though the evidence is less clear. What is undeniable is the sense of fear and frustration gripping the community. Parents worry that every breath their child takes could be dangerous. Teachers struggle to keep classrooms open as students fall ill. The city's hospitals are stretched to the brink, treating wave after wave of pollution-related sickness. Yet, the most bitter irony is that the very processes poisoning Gabes are banned in much of Europe. The methods used to extract and process phosphate, and the practice of dumping phosphogypsum into the sea, have been outlawed in many Western countries due to their devastating environmental impact. Observers note that while European consumers benefit from cheap fertilizers, Tunisian communities pay the price in poisoned air and water. This is not just an environmental issue. It is a question of justice, of whose lives are valued and whose are sacrificed. Despite a 2017 government promise to close the plant, production has only ramped up in recent years. The phosphate produced in Gabes is exported abroad, feeding global markets while local residents bear the brunt of the pollution. The plant is now state-owned, but the pattern is unmistakable. Africa's resources are extracted, processed, and shipped overseas, while the toxic byproducts are left behind. This is a modern form of toxic trade, echoing the colonial era when foreign powers exploited African land for their own gain. To place Gabes in a wider context, it is important to recognize that Tunisia's industrialization was shaped by both internal ambitions and external pressures. The global demand for phosphate, driven by agricultural industries in Europe and beyond, created incentives for rapid development with little regard for environmental safeguards. International financial institutions often encouraged export-oriented growth, sometimes at the expense of local health and ecological balance. This pattern is not unique to Tunisia. Across North Africa, countries have faced similar dilemmas: how to balance economic development with the protection of their people and environment. As protests erupt in Gabes, with residents demanding action and accountability, the government faces a stark choice. Will it protect its people, or prioritize foreign profits? The answer will shape not only the future of Gabes, but the broader struggle for environmental sovereignty across Africa. The situation in Gabes has also drawn attention from regional environmental groups and international observers, who see it as a test case for how African governments respond to the legacy of extractive industries. But Gabes is not alone. To see the full scale of environmental injustice on the continent, we turn to the Niger Delta, where the scars of exploitation run deep and the fight for justice has taken on a new, international dimension. The Niger Delta, in southern Nigeria, is one of the world's most oil-rich regions. For decades, its vast reserves have attracted multinational energy giants, drawn by the promise of immense profits. Among the most prominent are French corporations like Total Energies and Perenco, whose operations stretch across Nigeria and into the Republic of the Congo. These companies have become household names in Europe, but in the Delta, they are synonymous with pollution, displacement, and broken promises. The most visible symbol of this exploitation is gas flaring, the routine burning of natural gas that is released during oil extraction. At night, the Delta glows with the orange flames of flares, casting an eerie light over villages and farmland. The practice is both wasteful and deadly. Instead of capturing and using the gas, companies simply burn it off, releasing a toxic cocktail of greenhouse gases, soot, and chemicals into the atmosphere. It is important to clarify that while gas flaring is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions in Nigeria, it is not the largest single source in sub-Saharan Africa. According to recent studies, agriculture, forestry, and land use change remain the dominant contributors to emissions in the region. Nevertheless, gas flaring's local impact is severe and immediate. Acid rain falls on crops, stunting growth and destroying harvests. Rivers and streams are contaminated, killing fish and wildlife. The air is thick with smoke and particulates, leading to a surge in respiratory diseases and other health problems. For the people of the Delta, the right to a safe and healthy environment has become a distant dream. The impact of gas flaring goes beyond local suffering. The emissions contribute to global climate change, undermining efforts to build a sustainable future for Africa and the world. The Delta's wetlands, once a vital carbon sink, are now degraded and shrinking. The loss of biodiversity is accelerating, with countless species pushed to the brink of extinction. The Niger Delta's environmental crisis is not just a Nigerian problem. It is a regional and global issue, with implications for climate policy, food security, and public health across West and Central Africa. What makes the situation even more troubling is the role of foreign corporations. While gas flaring has been largely phased out in Europe and North America, it remains common practice in Africa, where regulations are weaker and enforcement is inconsistent. Observers note that French energy companies, in particular, have faced criticism for failing to uphold the same environmental standards abroad that they follow at home. The result is a double standard, where African communities are exposed to risks that would be unacceptable elsewhere. In recent years, local activists and international NGOs have begun to fight back, using new legal tools to hold corporations accountable. One of the most significant developments is the use of France's duty of vigilance law, which requires large companies to prevent human rights and environmental abuses throughout their global operations. In landmark lawsuits, groups have taken Total Energies and other firms to court in France, demanding justice for the people of the Niger Delta. It is important to note that, as of June 2024, there is no publicly documented lawsuit against Perenco under this law, but Total Energies has faced high-profile legal challenges. These legal battles are groundbreaking. For the first time, African communities are using Western laws to challenge the behavior of multinational corporations on their own soil. The cases are complex and slow-moving, but they represent a new front in the struggle for environmental sovereignty. If successful, they could set a precedent for holding companies accountable for the harm they cause abroad, not just at home. The fight is far from over. Oil companies have deep pockets and powerful allies, and the legal system is often stacked against local communities. But the lawsuits have already forced a public reckoning, shining a spotlight on practices that were once hidden from view. They have also inspired similar efforts in other countries, as activists seek to use international law to protect their rights and their environment. As we move from gabes to the Niger Delta, a pattern emerges. Whether it is toxic waste dumped into the sea or gas flared into the sky, the underlying dynamic is the same. African resources are exploited for foreign profit, while local people bear the costs. Environmental harm is outsourced to the continent, justified by economic necessity or technical limitations. Promises of development and progress are used to mask the reality of pollution and dispossession. But this is not the whole story. Across Africa, communities are rising up to demand change. In gabes, residents are organizing protests, collecting data, and pressuring the government to act. In the Niger Delta, activists are building alliances with international NGOs, using the courts to seek justice. These movements are part of a broader push for environmental sovereignty, the idea that African nations should have the power to control their own resources, set their own standards, and protect their own people. Environmental sovereignty is not just a legal or technical issue. It is a question of dignity, self-determination, and justice. For too long, Africa has been seen as a dumping ground for the world's waste, a source of cheap raw materials and easy profits. But the tide is turning. New laws, new alliances, and new voices are challenging the old order, demanding accountability from both governments and corporations. The stakes could not be higher. The health of millions hangs in the balance. The future of Africa's ecosystems, from the Mediterranean coast to the mangrove swamps of the Delta, is at risk. The continent's ability to chart its own course, free from external control, depends on the outcome of these struggles. To place these case studies in a broader context, it is essential to recognize that environmental injustice in Africa is not an accident or a series of isolated incidents. It is the product of historical forces, including colonialism, globalization, and the unequal distribution of power and resources. The legacy of exploitation is written into the landscape, visible in polluted rivers, barren fields, and sick children. Yet, there is also hope. The fight for environmental sovereignty is gaining momentum, driven by a new generation of activists, lawyers, and community leaders. They are using every tool at their disposal, from street protests to international litigation, to demand a better future. Their struggle is not just for themselves, but for the entire continent, and for the generations yet to come. Let's return for a moment to gabes, where the struggle for clean air continues. The city's fate hangs in the balance, caught between the promise of economic development and the reality of environmental harm. The government faces mounting pressure to honor its commitments, close the plant, and invest in safer, more sustainable industries. But change will not come easily. Powerful interests are at stake, and the costs of transition are high. In the Niger Delta, the battle is even more complex. The region's oil wealth has fueled corruption, conflict, and environmental destruction for decades. Efforts to regulate gas flaring have met with limited success, as companies exploit legal loopholes and evade accountability. The courts offer a glimmer of hope, but justice is slow and uncertain. Still, the determination of local communities is unwavering. In both Gabes and the Delta, people are refusing to accept the status quo. They are demanding answers, organizing for change, and insisting that their lives and their environment are worth protecting. Their courage is a reminder that environmental sovereignty is not just a policy goal, it is a lived reality, fought for every day. To understand the significance of these struggles, we need to look beyond the headlines and the statistics. Environmental injustice is not just about pollution or disease. It is about power, who has it, who wields it, and who is left out. In both Tunisia and Nigeria, the balance of power has long favored foreign corporations and distant governments, at the expense of local communities. But that balance is shifting, as new forms of resistance and accountability take root. One of the most important lessons from Gabes and the Niger Delta is the need for strong, independent institutions. Effective environmental regulation requires more than laws on paper, it demands enforcement, transparency, and public participation. Governments must be willing to stand up to powerful interests, both domestic and foreign, and prioritize the well-being of their citizens. Civil society must have the space and resources to hold leaders accountable, expose abuses, and advocate for change. The international community also has a role to play. Too often, foreign governments and corporations have turned a blind eye to environmental harm in Africa, focusing instead on profits and strategic interests. But as the lawsuits in France show, there are ways to use international law and pressure to promote accountability. Donors, investors, and consumers can support African efforts to build stronger institutions, enforce environmental standards, and protect vulnerable communities. At the same time, it is essential to recognize the limits of external intervention. True environmental sovereignty means that African nations must lead the way, setting their own priorities and making their own decisions. International support should be guided by respect for local knowledge, needs, and aspirations, not imposed from above. The path forward will not be easy. The forces arrayed against environmental justice are powerful and deeply entrenched. But the examples of Gabes and the Niger Delta offer reasons for hope. They show that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. They remind us that the fight for a healthy environment is inseparable from the broader struggle for justice, dignity, and self-determination. As we look to the future, the question is not whether Africa can achieve environmental sovereignty, but how. What strategies will be most effective? How can local and international actors work together to promote accountability and protect the environment? What lessons can be learned from past successes and failures? One key lesson is the importance of community engagement. In both Tunisia and Nigeria, grassroots movements have been at the forefront of the fight for environmental justice. They have mobilized public opinion, gathered evidence, and forced governments and corporations to respond. Their efforts have shown that ordinary people can make a difference, even against powerful adversaries. Another lesson is the need for legal innovation. The use of France's duty of vigilance law is a groundbreaking example of how international legal frameworks can be leveraged to hold corporations accountable. While the process is slow and complex, it offers a model for other countries and regions to follow. By building alliances across borders, activists can increase their leverage and amplify their impact. Finally, there is the challenge of building sustainable alternatives. Economic development is essential, but it must not come at the expense of health and the environment. African nations need support to invest in clean technologies, renewable energy, and sustainable industries. They need access to financing, technical expertise, and markets that reward responsible practices. The transition will be difficult, but it is necessary for the long-term well-being of the continent. The stories of Gabes and the Niger Delta are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger pattern of environmental injustice that affects millions across Africa. From mining in the Congo to deforestation in Madagascar, the continent faces a host of challenges that threaten its people and its future. But the response is also growing stronger as communities, governments, and international partners come together to demand change. To deepen our understanding, consider the broader economic forces at play. Africa's integration into global supply chains has often meant that the continent exports raw materials while importing environmental risks. The profits from these industries rarely stay local. Instead, they flow to multinational corporations and distant shareholders, leaving behind pollution, health crises, and social unrest. This pattern is reinforced by trade agreements and investment deals that prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability. Recent reports indicate that in many African countries, environmental regulations are weakened or bypassed to attract foreign investment, creating a race to the bottom that undermines both ecological and social resilience. The legacy of colonialism looms large over these dynamics. During the colonial era, European powers carved up Africa's territories, extracting resources with little regard for local needs or environmental consequences. The infrastructure built during this period was designed to move goods out of the continent, not to support sustainable development. Today, many of the same patterns persist, albeit in new forms. The language of partnership and development often masks the reality of unequal power relations and persistent exploitation. Yet, there are signs of change. Across the continent, new legal frameworks are emerging to protect the environment and hold polluters accountable. Countries like Kenya and South Africa have enacted progressive environmental laws, and regional bodies such as the African Union are beginning to prioritize ecological issues in their policy agendas. These efforts are supported by a growing network of civil society organizations, researchers, and journalists who are shining a light on environmental abuses and advocating for reform. Expert voices are increasingly calling for a rethinking of Africa's development model. Economists and environmental scientists argue that the continent's future depends on breaking the cycle of resource extraction and dependency. Instead, they advocate for investments in value-added industries, circular economies, and green technologies that can create jobs without sacrificing health or the environment. Reports from international agencies highlight the potential for renewable energy in Africa, noting that the continent's abundant solar and wind resources could power a new era of sustainable growth if harnessed responsibly. The role of education and public awareness cannot be overstated. In both Tunisia and Nigeria, local universities and research institutes are playing a crucial role in documenting environmental impacts and training the next generation of leaders. Their work provides the data and analysis needed to inform policy and hold decision-makers accountable. At the same time, community-based organizations are using social media and other platforms to share information, mobilize support, and connect with allies around the world. Regional cooperation is also essential. Environmental challenges do not respect national borders. Pollution in one country can easily spread to its neighbors, affecting air, water, and food supplies across entire regions. The Nile Basin Initiative, the Lake Chad Basin Commission, and other regional bodies offer models for how countries can work together to manage shared resources and address common threats. By pooling expertise and resources, African nations can strengthen their bargaining power in international negotiations and ensure that their interests are represented. As we reflect on these themes, it is important to recognize the role of the international community. Global efforts to address climate change and promote sustainable development must include meaningful support for African-led initiatives. This means providing financing, technology transfer, and capacity building, but also respecting the right of African nations to set their own priorities and make their own decisions. Too often, international aid comes with strings attached or is shaped by donor interests rather than local needs. True partnership requires mutual respect and a commitment to shared goals. At this point, let's pause and consider your role in this story. If you believe that these issues matter, take a moment to share this video or discuss it with others. The more people who understand the stakes, the greater the pressure on decision makers to act. Your engagement can help amplify the voices of those fighting for justice in Gabes, the Niger Delta, and beyond. We cannot continue without your support. Like, share, and subscribe so that these stories reach more people and drive real change. Returning to our central theme, the fight for environmental sovereignty is not just about resisting exploitation. It is about building a new vision for Africa's future, one that is rooted in justice, equity, and sustainability. This vision requires courage, creativity, and collaboration. It demands that governments, businesses, and communities work together to find solutions that balance economic growth with environmental protection. The path ahead is challenging, but not impossible. The examples of Gabes and the Niger Delta show that even in the face of powerful interests, change is possible. Legal victories, policy reforms, and grassroots mobilization are already making a difference. The key is to sustain this momentum, learn from setbacks, and build on successes. To further illustrate the scale of the challenge, consider the example of Zambia's copperbelt, where mining has left behind contaminated soils and water supplies, affecting the health of entire communities. In Ghana, illegal gold mining known as galamsey has devastated rivers and forests, prompting government crackdowns and community-led restoration efforts. In Madagascar, deforestation for export crops has threatened unique ecosystems and the livelihoods of local people. These examples show that environmental injustice is not confined to a few hotspots, but is woven into the fabric of Africa's economic and political life. At the same time, innovative solutions are emerging from within African communities. In Kenya, the Green Belt movement, founded by Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai, has mobilized thousands to plant trees, restore degraded land, and empower women. In South Africa, community monitors track pollution and hold mining companies accountable, using mobile technology to gather evidence and alert authorities. In Senegal, fishermen have partnered with scientists to rebuild fish stocks and protect marine habitats. These initiatives demonstrate the power of local knowledge and collective action to drive change from the ground up. International organizations are also playing a role, though their impact depends on genuine partnership with local actors. The United Nations Environment Programme has supported cleanup efforts in the Niger Delta, while the World Bank has funded projects to improve environmental governance in several African countries. However, experts caution that lasting progress requires more than technical fixes or external funding. It demands political will, institutional reform, and a commitment to justice. One area where progress is being made is in the use of data and technology to monitor environmental impacts. Satellite imagery, remote sensing, and citizen science are providing new tools to track deforestation, pollution, and climate change across the continent. These technologies are helping to expose abuses, inform policy, and empower communities to defend their rights. For example, in Nigeria, local groups have used drone footage to document oil spills and support legal claims against polluters. In Tunisia, researchers are mapping pollution hotspots and sharing findings with the public to raise awareness and demand action. As Africa confronts the twin challenges of development and environmental protection, the choices made today will shape the continent's future for generations. The struggle for environmental sovereignty is about more than controlling resources or enforcing laws. It is about redefining what progress means and who benefits from it. It is about building societies that value health, dignity, and sustainability as much as economic growth. In conclusion, the struggle for environmental justice in Africa is a defining issue of our time. It is about more than pollution or profits. It is about who gets to decide the fate of Africa's land, water, and air. It is about the right of every person to live in a safe and healthy environment. It is about the unfinished business of decolonization, the struggle to build societies that are just, equitable, and sustainable. As we close this exploration, consider what role you can play. Will you stand with those fighting for justice in Gabes and the Niger Delta? Will you support efforts to hold corporations accountable and promote environmental sovereignty? The choices we make today will shape the future of Africa and the world. What do you see as the strongest force shaping Africa's future: sovereignty, accountability, or something else? Share your view below. Your voice matters, and together, we can help build a more just and sustainable world.